Український дисидентський рух набув своєї активності в 70-х роках минулого століття. Його репрезентували найкращі представники.
The Ukrainian dissident movement stepped up its activity in the 1970s. Representatives of the Ukrainian intelligentsia from eastern regions, in particular people whose life was connected with the Donbas region, made up its majority. A Soviet general, one of the founders of the Ukrainian Helsinki group, Petro Grigorenko, was one of them.
На комсомольській роботі в місті Селідовому.
Hero of Ukraine, Mykola Rudenko, writer and head of the Ukrainian Helsinki group, was born in the Luhansk region. Leaders of the Ukrainian opposition movement, writers Ivan and Nadia Svitlichna, also came from Luhansk. Ivan Duzuba, hero of Ukraine, literary theorist, author of the book Internationalism or Russification. This book became a manifesto of the dissident movement. Duzuba was born not far from Donetsk. Hero of Ukraine, Vyacheslav Chornovil, a famous Ukrainian politician, spent a part of his life in the Donbas. He got into trouble for his unorthodox views while studying at the Taras Shevchenko University in Kiev. In 1958, he took a one-year vacation and went to work at a large metallurgy plant in Mariupol as a joiner, and later he worked as an editor for the Kiev newspaper Komsomolets. 3 Ukrainian political prisoners who died in a Perm prisons camp in Russia were also connected with the Donbas. Vasil Stus studied at a secondary school in Donetsk and then graduated from the Donetsk Pedagogic Institute. At the beginning of the 1960s, he worked as a teacher of Ukrainian language and literature at a secondary school in Horlivka. He later worked at the Zhovtnevi mine in Donetsk. From 1963, he worked as a literary editor at the socialist Donbas newspaper and then went to Kiev to study in a postgraduate course.
Не вступив в аспірантуру і не поїхав до Києва на навчання.
Oleksa Tykhy, a Ukrainian linguist, was born near Kramatorsk. After graduation from the Moscow University, he worked as a teacher in the Donbas. He was imprisoned 3 times for anti-Soviet activity.
Юрій Литвин, український поет.
Yuri Litvin, a Ukrainian poet, writer and journalist. After finishing secondary school, he went to the Donbas, graduated from a mining college and then worked in a mine. He was arrested 5 times and in total he was handed down a 41-year prison term. Considering the events that took place in Donbas in March 2014 and what is happening there now, we can't but wonder how it happened that the Donbas gave the kickstart to such a huge number of outstanding activists of the Ukrainian national liberation movement of the 1970s. In Soviet times, the Donbas became a small model of the Soviet Union, where a new community of Soviet citizens was formed. National features of those people were completely erased. They were brought up as Soviet people, not Ukrainians. Dissidents started their activity in the 1960s. They were known as 60ers. What features were typical for dissidents? Unlike Russian dissidents who fought for human rights, Ukrainian activists defended not only human rights, but also fought for the right of a nation to self-determination. Their intensive activity was aimed at preventing the loss of national identity of natives of the Donbas region, which was historically Ukrainian.
Своєї національної ідентичності спокон віку української. Вони і вели свою напружену боротьбу і діяльність.
Why did it happen that the Donbas allowed all that was national and spiritual in the region to be totally leveled? We should look into history to find the answers to this burning question. The Donbas is a frontier area between 2 Cossack lands of Zaporizhian and Don Cossacks. Refugees and criminals settled there to find better fortune in life. Politically, the Donbas has always been unstable and unpredictable. It was difficult even for Marxists to organize local workers, most of whom lost their roots and habits of living, a settled way of life, and were not easily controlled by the authorities. Even the Bolshevik Revolution of 1917, also known in history as the October Revolution, and the Civil War didn't turn Donbas into a politically reliable territory for the Bolsheviks. However, in truth, the Bolshevik Party was victorious in the Civil War due to the efforts of local workers, but the Donbas was never positioned as a region blindly followed the course of the Bolsheviks party. As the old adage goes, the blind leading the blind. Ukrainian-speaking peasants who lived near mining towns and cities were always under suspicion of the Bolsheviks. Even after the war ended, workers' strikes in the Donbas were more frequent than in other industrial centers of Ukraine. The Donbas was considered an economically important region that was inhabited by workers who were difficult to control. The western part of the Donbas was mostly Ukrainian and its eastern part predominantly Russian. The Donbas has always been an ethnically non-homogeneous region. According to 1937 census data, over 40 years the Donbas population increased from 700,000 to 4.5 million. In 1926, the ethnic Donbas population was made up of 53.2% of Ukrainians, 34.1% of Russians, 5.1% of Greeks, 2% of Germans and Jews, and 1% of Belarusians, Tatars and Poles. Moscow considered this multinational composition of the Donbas population to be a potential threat of Ukrainian separatism, and ethnic groups, in particular Germans, could become a danger for Moscow during global conflicts such as World War I and World War II. Unlike ethnic Russians, ethnic Ukrainians were always under the suspicion of the Moscow Authority. Numerous facts to prove this can be found in the book titled Evil Deeds of the Kremlin, published in 1953 in Toronto. Donbas miner Petro Litsenko, charged as an oppositionist and arrested in 1932, said that he was tortured by punitive organs in Yenakievo. Ukrainians from Halichnia, that was part of Poland, were under no less suspicion than ethnic Germans and Poles. Donbas miners were arrested for reading Ukrainian nationalist literature. In 1935, several Ukrainians from Alchevsk were repressed for their protest against the use of the Russian language at rallies. The authority was suspicious of people who moved to the Donbas from frontier territories, where Ukrainians lived in the Vychovnia region, near the Soviet-Romanian border. They came to the Donbas to work in the middle of the 1930s. He worked at a local military plant and was arrested by the Prosecutor General's office due to his place of origin. He was kept in prison for 4 months, and after that was exiled to labor camps in Siberia. As the Donbas was a major industrial center, all sorts of runaways, disposed peasants and persons stripped of their civil rights preferred to come to the Donbas, seeking jobs in mines and hiding from persecution. The Donbas always attracted people despite the dangerous mining work and tough living conditions. Therefore, the Moscow Authority always considered the Donbas to be a den of enemies. That was one more reason to hold repressions there. Ukraine was the one Soviet republic which suffered political repressions in the 1930s the most, and the Donbas suffered more than other regions in Ukraine, with state terror being severe there. The number of repressed former gulags in the Donbas was the highest in Ukraine, a total of 14,832, compared to 8,117 in the Dnipropetrovsk region. In other regions, these numbers were lower. According to data from a Russian Center for Contemporary History Studies, by December 1st, 1935, 560 people were arrested as spies. Trotsky sympathizers, nationalists, fascists or terrorists in the Donetsk Oblast, 408 in the Dnipropetrovsk Oblast, 350 in the Kharkiv Oblast, and 264 in the Kiev region. As a result of repressions, the number of party members in the Donbas was reduced twofold during the period between 1933 and 1936. For Moscow, the Donbas was the weakest link in the chain of the process of total industrialization of the country. The rates of output growth and labor productivity in mines were lower than expected by the Moscow Authority, which clearly slowed down the industrial development of the country. Stalin and the Moscow Politburo often had to personally intervene into the situation in the Donbas. It was not accidental that the notorious Shakti trial of mine engineers charged with the crime of economic counter-revolution took place in the Donbas In 1928, the trial was controlled by Stalin himself, and the trial itself was held not in the Donbas, but in Moscow, which confirmed its importance for the Kremlin's top brass. The 1930s in the Donbas have become notorious not only for repressions, but also for intensified atheist movements against the church, orchestrated by the Bolsheviks. Activists of the movement destroyed churches and cathedrals built by the local population in the 19th century. They ruined the Sviato-Harlampievsky Cathedral and 5 large Orthodox churches in Mariupol. The Holy Mountains Lavra has survived until today. As in the 1920s, it began operating as a sanatorium for Donbas workers. The monks' cells were transformed into sanatorium rooms. A cinema was built on the premises of the Holy Mountains Cathedral and library in the Holy Intercession Cathedral. Names given to the Donbas settlements turned the region into a bona fide communist pantheon. You can find here names of the top leaders of the Communist Party. In the post-war period, the Donbas suffered another trial, namely forced Russification. Qualified workers from Russia were sent to Donbas to restore its industrial productivity. In the 1960s, there were 2 million Russians. In the 1970s, this figure had grown to 3 million people that came from Russia. For their convenience, all official document processing was done in the Russian language, which there was the language of internation communication in the USSR. In Ukrainian linguistics operations, a special system of assimilation of the Ukrainian language into Russian language was introduced to force out the use of the Ukrainian language outright. This policy was aimed at nullifying the differences between Ukrainians and Russians. In line with such a trend, many Ukrainians were forced to change their nationality to Russian. The language of this region seemed to be a mixture of 2 languages and was a kind of Ukrainian-Russian dialect called by linguists surzik. By establishing a mini-Soviet Union on the territory of the Donbas, it was turned into a region that had been stripped of its national identity. In 1991, teachers of the Ukrainian language who graduated from university couldn't find a job, as there was only one Ukrainian language school in Donetsk.
В 91-му році, мені здається, в Донецьку діяла лише одна українська школа.
Had the Dissidents been able to continue their activity and achieve their goal, the Donbas wouldn't have lost its Ukrainian national identity. What about the majority of the Donbas population? Were people unhappy about the situation in the region? Events happening around make me sad, Oleksandr Tukhy wrote in his book, Thoughts about Native Donetsk Land. People became absolutely indifferent to everything that was beautiful, sacred, moral and human. Ukrainian theatres stopped operating and nobody regrets it. The main form of entertainment for the youth is playing guitar, enjoying groups playing electric music or dancing to tape recorder music. People have lost their ideals and forgot both old and new traditions and customs. They are stuck to TV, go to the cinema, drink and endlessly talk about football, motorbikes, money-making, lotteries and sex.
Не можна сказати, що народ підтримував їх на 100%.
I would not say that 100% of the people supported the dissidents movement. If you read Vasil Stut's biography, you will find many interesting things about the town of Horlivka, where he worked. He called it an alien environment, but when I was making a film about the Stutz family, I communicated with his sister, and she told me many interesting things I did not know. She said that people sympathized with the dissidents, and it was not ideological support, rather sympathy. At the time, she said she hadn't felt hostility towards her or her brother. But considering Stutz's difficult fate, they did sympathize with him and his mission. Today, there are many disputes about what the Donbas is now. Is it Ukrainian or anti-Ukrainian? Is it special or pro-Russian?
Донбас скоріше прорадянський. Коли перед початком тієї так
The
званої
Donbas is rather pro-Soviet, according to the results of a sociological survey conducted in Donetsk. 70% of the local population were against the separation of Donetsk from Ukraine.
практично 70% опитаних були
So it is wrong to say that there were always some anti-Ukrainian sentiments in the Donbas. That's how propaganda works.
говорити про те, що там завжди були якісь антиукраїнські настрої. Ні. Так працює пропаганда.
In the opinion of one expert on Donbas history, American professor Kuromia, the war in the Donbas is absurd from the very outset, as it happened neither for historical nor political reasons. He thinks the well-known predisposition of people of the Donbas having an independent opinion wasn't a reason to start the war. Although the process of integration of the Donbas into the Ukrainian state was unstable from 1991, it progressed, but Moscow wanted to maintain control over it. After Moscow failed, it decided to use military force to stop such ostensibly anti-Moscow progress and mentality of the local population.